So I recently did some rather extensive testing with the Skyreat anamorphic lens on my GoPro Hero 11. And I tested a bunch of different settings because I wanted to determine what settings work all of the time, some of the time, and none of the time with this anamorphic lens. And up front, I think it is important to talk about what the purpose of this anamorphic lens is. In a nutshell, the primary purpose of this anamorphic lens is for you to get a wider angle linear finished product. So you can shoot with the linear lens on the GoPro and it's great, but if you use the anamorphic lens, your linear finished product basically ends up being about the same lens width equivalent as the wide angle, but you don't have that distortion with it. Now the footage will be a little bit soft at the edges when you use the anamorphic lens. That is normal. You get a little bit more stretch in that finished product than the linear straight out of the GoPro. And of course, it's worth mentioning that this particular anamorphic lens is compatible with the Hero 9, 10, and 11 Black. So if you're interested in seeing which one I own, I've linked to it in the description below if you want to check it out. So first of all, here are the settings that worked every time. Did not have any problem with these settings. They worked if I was moving, they worked if I was stationary, they worked great every time. The first setting is setting the lens to linear. Setting that lens to linear gave me the best results, hands down. There is one other lens setting that can work some of the time, but linear is the tried and true working all the time setting. It will not let you down if you choose linear. The second setting that worked all the time, every time, is turning hypersmooth off as long as you are also pairing your GoPro with a gimbal. So the gimbals that I like to use in my GoPro are the Inky Falcon Plus. This would fall under the budget category. It generally goes for about $89. And this one would be the same, the Hohem iSteady Pro 4. I like this gimbal as well when it comes to budget gimbals. This one is also about $89. But the important thing to note about those two gimbals is they do have an approximate 200 gram weight limit. When you have this anamorphic lens on your GoPro, as well as the battery inside, it's going to tend to weigh right around that 200 grams, maybe a few grams over. And that can pose some problems. First of all, it can be hard to balance it. And the second potential problem is if it's a little bit too heavy, it can work these motors hard and it could cause them to fail a little bit sooner, or they simply just may not stabilize it as well as some other gimbals would. So my ultimate favorite gimbal to use with GoPros is this Moza Mini P. It actually comes with a nice hard foam case. And basically the main difference with this gimbal is this one can support a payload up to about 2 pounds. So with the Moza Mini P, you can put a mirrorless camera on it, some of the smaller ones, as long as the lens isn't too heavy. But this one can easily accommodate a GoPro action camera or other action cameras. Even if you were to have the media mod on this or with this anamorphic lens, the weight is not a problem. But at the same time, it's a heavy enough minimum weight that it will balance and stabilize really nicely. But the Moza Mini P does cost more than these gimbals. The Moza Mini P is usually right around $150 to $190. So there is a trade-off. But if you're gonna use a gimbal a lot with your GoPro, or you have some other cameras that are maybe some of the smaller mirrorless or DSLR, then the Moza Mini P might be a great choice for you. If you do use the Hohem iSteady Pro 4 or the Inky Falcon Plus, you just wanna make sure to not have a lot of ridiculous movement, so you probably don't wanna run with these gimbals. But yes, having hypersmooth off and using a gimbal to stabilize the footage worked each time, every time, as long as the gimbal could accommodate the weight of the camera and balance properly with the anamorphic lens. And when it comes to frame rate and resolution, you can use 5.3K 24, 5.3K 60, 4K 120. You can basically pick any frame rate and resolution and it will work. That will not matter with this. And the great news is you can do some pretty incredible slow motion with this too. I had a great time doing some 4K 120 footage the other day in snow. And it was a fabulous filming environment with those giant snowflakes, my son getting all excited about it. I got kind of excited about it too because I like snow. But the anamorphic lens gave an extra cinematic artistic touch to it, and I really liked that. Now the final thing to talk about that works each time, every time, is the de-squeezing. So Skyreat says this is a 1.33 times anamorphic lens. However, when you go to de-squeeze it, I find that it works better if you de-squeeze it to about 1.2. If you have anything circular in your frame, or if you have a human subject in there, if you do the 1.33, you may find that it looks a little bit flatter than it should, so a little bit more oblong. I find that de-squeezing it to about 1.2 works each time, every time. If you do the 1.33 with landscapes without human subjects or certain types of buildings in there, it will probably work just fine for you, and I've had no problems with that. But if you want it to be right each time, every time, do the 1.2 when you're de-squeezing, and that's going to give you great results. And a side note on that, when it comes to the black bars, you are going to have the black bars on the top and the bottom, because when you put it on a 16:9 timeline, it's not going to fill out that frame vertically. One other important note is when you're filming the footage on here on the GoPro, you do want to do it in 16:9 for the mode. You don't want to do in the 4:3 or the 8:7 mode. The lens will not work properly with those. So you do have to do 16:9 each time on the GoPro. So next, let's talk about the settings that worked some of the time, but not all of the time. So these would be settings you could experiment with and they might work for you. But if you want those tried and true settings that are gonna work every time, all the time, you don't want to try these. So the first setting that can work some of the time is you can have hypersmooth on with the lens in linear. If you're not doing a lot of up and down or side to side movements, or if those are really slow pans, it may work for you. It's going to depend on the lighting and it's going to depend on what's in your frame, but it could work for you. It did work for me some of the time, and then it didn't work for me some of the time. I found that it gave me quite a bit of wobble and weirdness to it if I moved too fast, or if I did any up or down or side to side movement. If I went slowly forwards without doing side to side or up and down, the hypersmooth would generally work okay. It was with hypersmooth on the lowest setting, so no boost or anything like that. Something else that worked some of the time, but not all of the time, is turning hypersmooth off and then stabilizing the footage with Real Steady. Now, Real Steady is a $99 add-on that you can purchase to add to the GoPro Player software. So when you put your footage in there later on, you can stabilize it using the gyroscope data from the GoPro. So for that, you would have hypersmooth off on the GoPro, and you would stabilize the footage in post. It would work, again, if you were not doing any drastic side-to-side or up-and-down movements. If you kept this relatively still and smooth while you were filming, it will work okay. For instance, if you used it on one of these gimbals, but were moving kind of fast, so you might have gotten some jitter with this, Real Steady can generally correct that. But if you were doing like some running with this and letting the camera do this, Real Steady won't be able to do that. First of all, it will crop the footage a lot. And in the end, you're not going to get that really wide footage that you're going for, because Real Steady is going to do quite a crop on it. Another setting that worked some of the time, but not all of the time, you can set the lens on here to wide with hypersmooth off and a zoom of about 1.2x. If you don't do the zoom on there, you are going to see the side of the lens where it ends. You're gonna have black on each side in the exact curve of this lens. So you're gonna have it on all four sides. That corresponds to the outline of this anamorphic lens. So I find that using the wide doesn't really have a point, because once you put that wide into Real Steady later on, it has to crop it to stabilize it. And in the end, you end up with less footage in your frame than you would have if you just did linear and de-squeezed it. Because you can't use the wide with hypersmooth, that won't work at all. So really, I don't recommend using the wide angle. I experimented with it to see if it could be done. It could be done, but the eventual crop basically negates any advantage that you could gain from that. The one exception to that could be if you're using this stationary. If you have it in wide with hypersmooth off, because you don't need that in stationary, and a little bit of a zoom, that 1.2, that resulting footage could end up about the same width as the linear, maybe slightly wider. But that would be about the only use case where it would work some of the time consistently. And now for the settings that didn't work. You don't want to do these any of the time at all. They will not work. The first one is any lens wider than the wide lens. So if you want to do super view or hyperview, any of those, anything above wide will not work. You would have to crop it way in, cropping it so much to the point that it would look really bad, and there's no point in wasting your time on that. The second setting that will not work at all, anytime, is the wide angle lens with hypersmooth on. That doesn't work, the footage gets way too wobbly. There's not really anything you can do to correct that if you film it that way. So don't make the mistake of doing that. You don't want to do hypersmooth on with the wide angle lens. You also don't want to do linear plus horizon leveling with hypersmooth, which, by the way, linear plus horizon leveling is only available as an option if you have hypersmooth on. So if you turn hypersmooth off, you don't have it as an option anyway. But if you do that option, because of the horizon leveling and the way that works, your footage will end up really wobbly. It'll be unusable there as well. And as I mentioned before, you don't want to film in 4:3 or 8:7 aspect ratios. You do want to keep it to 16:9 for your filming on the GoPro. If you do either of those, it will not work either. So there you go. There you have a rundown of the settings that do and do not work with the Skyreat anamorphic lens on your GoPro Hero 9, 10, and 11. If you own this lens, I hope you have a lot of fun experimenting with it. It really is a fun lens, and I love the results it can give. Until we talk again, happy GoProing.